January 1815. The frost lay heavy on London's rooftops, the Thames a sluggish mirror for a kingdom at rest. After 22 years of near-constant war, the guns of Europe had fallen silent. Bonaparte, the man who had reshaped the continent, was caged upon the island of Elba. Across Britain, the people exhaled, uncertain of what peace even meant anymore. The victory felt absolute, yet beneath the relief there stirred a quiet, persistent unease, as if history itself were holding its breath. Wellington, the soldier now turned statesman, moved through the salons and corridors of power as a figure both admired and feared. To the British public, he was the Iron Duke, unbending, victorious, the man who had driven the French from Spain and Portugal. But those who truly knew him saw something deeper, a man marked by war's discipline and by its ghosts. His gaze was steady, his voice measured, his manner coldly precise. Yet there was fatigue there too, a quiet melancholy that clung to him like the smoke of old battlefields. For all his triumphs, Wellington understood that peace was the hardest campaign of all. Across Europe, the victors of 1814 met in Vienna to redraw the map. Monarchs, ministers, and soldiers negotiating the shape of a continent bled white. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia sought stability, but each saw it differently. The French monarchy had been restored under Louis XVIII, a tired old man who ruled a restless nation. And though Napoleon sat in exile, reports drifted across the continent that he was restless too, commanding workmen, inspecting ships, still issuing orders to nobody in particular. Europe wanted to forget him. Napoleon had no intention of being forgotten. In London, peace had brought prosperity for some, hardship for others. Thousands of veterans returned from the peninsula, their bodies broken, their livelihoods uncertain. The city streets filled with beggars in tattered uniforms, men who had once marched in victory under Wellington's command. In Parliament, debates flared over the cost of war and the burden of peace. The industrial towns of the north grew restless, their factories booming, but their workers impoverished. For every bell that rang in celebration of peace, another tolled for the hunger that followed. Britain had survived Napoleon, but survival was not the same as healing. Wellington himself was not at ease. His new duties as ambassador to France demanded tact, not muskets. Persuasion, not force. Yet diplomacy could be as perilous as battle. In Paris, he walked through streets scarred by revolution and empire, where the tricolour still haunted the air like a ghost. The Bourbon court whispered of loyalty, but dreamt of vengeance. Every salon, every supper table was a theatre of intrigue. Wellington's composure, that calm, statuesque patience, was his armour. But even armour can crack. Privately, he wrote of his fears, that France's peace was hollow, built upon sand and bitterness. At the same time, on a tiny island in the Mediterranean, Napoleon plotted his return. To his captors, he played the role of weary exile, gracious, defeated, reflective. But his eyes betrayed him. He studied maps, calculated tides, and weighed loyalties. He knew France's army still adored him, that the people's hearts beat faster at the memory of his name. Europe had underestimated him before. He intended they should do so once again. Back in Britain, Wellington received reports of unrest in France, rumors of mutiny in the regiments left behind by the Bourbons. He read them carefully, silently, then folded each letter with precision. To some he seemed unmoved. To others, he looked as though he were already waiting for something inevitable. He had once said that Napoleon's presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 men. Perhaps he understood that the emperor's absence could be equally dangerous. As January gave way to February, a thin crust of frost clung to the English countryside. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, there was laughter and waltzing, the illusion of stability. Yet for those who had seen the world torn apart, peace felt fragile, a fine porcelain cup set upon a trembling table. Wellington would later recall that these months were like the calm between two storms, deceptive, seductive, and short-lived. For all his command of strategy, Wellington could not control what was to come. History's tide was already turning beyond the horizon. In Paris, Bonaparte's supporters whispered of liberty betrayed. In Vienna, diplomats drafted treaties that would crumble in months. And across the Channel, British troops idled in Belgium, unaware that their next march would decide the fate of Europe itself. There, in the silence of winter, the stage was being set for the final act of the age. The soldiers sharpened their bayonets. The kings adjusted their crowns. The people, weary, yearning, uncertain, waited for the next rumor of war. Wellington, ever the realist, prepared for the worst, even as he hoped for the best. Perhaps that was his truest strength. The courage to recognize peace not as an end, but as an interval. For when peace trembles, even victory offers no refuge. The dawn broke over the Mediterranean with a deceptive calm. On the island of Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror, emperor, exile, stepped aboard a small brig named Inconstant. It was February 26th, 1815. Around him, loyal veterans of the Old Guard watched the horizon with the eyes of men who had followed him through 1,000 fires. "France," he said simply, "cannot do without me." Within hours, the sails caught the wind, and the most dangerous man in Europe was free once more. News of his escape moved like wildfire across the continent. Couriers galloped through Alpine passes. Dispatches crossed the Channel. In London, ministers sat stunned in the flickering light of oil lamps. The peace, barely a year old, was already fracturing. At Vienna, the great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, were still dividing the spoils of Napoleon's fall when the impossible reached their tables. The Eagle had left Elba. For a moment, there was disbelief. Then outrage. Then fear. In France, the returning emperor became a force of nature. He landed near Cannes with barely 1,000 men, ragged, half-starved, but burning with devotion. Yet as he marched north through Grenoble, Lyon, and Auxerre, the miracle unfolded. Whole regiments sent to stop him defected instead, joining his ranks. Peasants poured from the villages, cheering, throwing flowers before his horse. By the time Napoleon entered Paris in March, the tricolour fluttered once again above the Tuileries. Louis XVIII fled into the night, and the Bourbon monarchy crumbled without a shot fired. Europe's nightmare had returned in less than 20 days. Across the Channel, Britain's answer came swiftly. The Duke of Wellington, newly appointed commander of the Allied forces in the Low Countries, received his orders with characteristic calm. There was no triumph in his expression, only a cold, deliberate resolve. He had faced Napoleon's marshals before, Masséna, Soult, Marmont, but never the man himself. This time, it would be the emperor's mind against his own. By early April, Wellington arrived in Brussels. The Belgian capital hummed with uneasy energy, a garrison city that felt both festive and fragile. British officers filled its cafes. Young soldiers flirted at dances, unaware that within months they would fight on the bloodiest field of their lives. Around them, Wellington's headquarters pulsed with quiet intensity. He reorganized supply lines, inspected fortifications, and drilled his troops in the rain. His army was a patchwork. British regulars, Dutch Belgians, Hanoverians, and Germans. Brave men, but strangers to one another. He knew discipline would have to replace familiarity. Napoleon, meanwhile, rebuilt his empire at lightning speed. In just 6 weeks, he restored the army to nearly 200,000 men. Not the veterans of Austerlitz or Jena, but enough to inspire Europe's dread. He promised peace, yet every step of his preparation spoke of war. He wrote to kings and ministers with the language of reason, but his movements betrayed ambition. The soil of France, he told his council, must not again be trampled by foreigners. The illusion was brief. By June, Europe's armies were mobilizing once more. The roads of northern France grew heavy with marching feet, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and rain. Farmers hid their grain. Villages emptied at the rumor of soldiers. The emperor's tricolour banners glistened in the mist. Blue, white, red, symbols of defiance to some, of doom to others. Every mile brought him closer to the Belgian frontier, where Wellington waited. In Brussels, the Duke's calm became legendary. He dined, he inspected, he attended the Duchess of Richmond's ball. Yet behind that composure, he was mapping the terrain, memorizing ridges and roads, weighing the temperament of his generals. His genius was not for reckless brilliance, but for endurance, the art of never losing his head while others did. He knew Napoleon would strike fast and hard, aiming to divide his forces before they could unite with the Prussians under Blücher. The campaign would hinge on days, perhaps hours. On the night of June 15th, the storm finally broke. French troops crossed the River Sambre, smashing through outposts at Charleroi. The drums of war rolled once more across Europe. At dawn, couriers thundered into Brussels with the news. Within hours, Wellington's army was on the move, a living machine of 30,000 men, muskets gleaming in the pale light. Officers scrambled for orders, soldiers tightened their packs, Horses whinnied as if sensing what awaited them. The calm of Brussels dissolved into motion. As the two titans maneuvered across the sodden plains of Belgium, their armies mirrored their masters. Napoleon marched with the unity of purpose born of a single will. Wellington's held together through trust. Trust in discipline, in steadiness, in the quiet authority of a man who did not waste words. Both knew what was at stake. For Napoleon, it was redemption, one final chance to restore the empire of his youth. For Wellington, it was civilization itself. The fragile peace of Europe, the belief that tyranny could be defeated not once, but forever. And so they marched, banners high, through rain and mud and the ghosts of old campaigns. The map of Europe, barely redrawn, burned once more at its edges. Across those fields, destiny was gathering its strength. The world had exhaled too soon. Sometimes history does not whisper its return. It thunders back with drums and steel, demanding a reckoning. The rain had stopped just before dusk. Over Brussels the air hung heavy, a stillness before something vast and terrible. Inside the Duke of Richmond's townhouse, candles glowed against gilt mirrors, violins played, and the scent of perfume and powder floated through the rooms. It was the evening of June 15th, 1815, and as waltzes turned beneath the chandeliers, Wellington received the news that Napoleon had crossed the frontier. He did not flinch. The Duke folded the dispatch neatly, set down his glass, and turned to the Duchess with a quiet smile. "The ball should go on," he said. And so it did, a strange calm in the eye of the storm. Officers in scarlet and blue danced with their partners beneath painted ceilings, laughter hiding the drumbeat of distant thunder. Somewhere beyond the candlelight, French cannon were already firing across the Belgian border. Wellington moved among them with composed grace, exchanging polite words, his mind racing far ahead. The charm, the serenity, it was armor. For years he had trained himself to stillness. In India's dust, in Portugal's hills, in the ruinous fields of Spain. He had learned that a general's calm must shield not only himself, but everyone who looked to him. Panic spreads faster than musket fire. Confidence steadies more men than bullets ever could. Beneath the music, he was mapping movements. Which brigades would march at dawn, where the roads crossed. How to unite Blücher's Prussians before Napoleon could divide them. By midnight, the ball had thinned. Officers kissed their wives and sweethearts goodbye, mounted their horses, and rode into the darkness. The soft clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the city, a sound that would stay in memory long after the war. Among them rode the young and untested, boys of 20 barely old enough to shave, now bound for battle. In the lamplight, some turned back for one last glimpse of their partners in silk and satin. History would later remember the scene as romantic. In truth, it was tragic. Beyond Brussels, the countryside was already alive with movement. Columns of British, Dutch, and German troops trudged through mud and rain toward the crossroads at Quatre Bras. Wagons creaked, boots squelched, lanterns swung in the gloom. Farmers watched from doorways, faces pale, as the Allied army passed, a patchwork of languages and uniforms bound by one purpose. Many had never fought together before. Some had never fought at all. Wellington's task was monumental, to weld these fragments into a single, disciplined force before Napoleon struck them apart. The Duke's headquarters became a hive of command. Couriers came and went through the night, their horses steaming in the courtyard. Maps were spread across tables, candles guttering in the draught. Wellington's pen scratched through orders with precise economy. No rhetoric, no flourish. Move at dawn. Support Blücher. Hold the line at all costs. His aides would later recall the stillness of his voice, as though he were dictating logistics for a dinner rather than the movements of nations. Yet that composure hid an unspoken truth. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and facing the most brilliant commander of the age. Napoleon's army was moving with terrifying speed. Veterans of the Imperial Guard, cuirassiers gleaming under storm clouds, advanced with the confidence of men who had followed their emperor from the pyramids to Moscow. At Charleroi and Fleurus, the tricolour rose once more above captured outposts. Napoleon's plan was ruthless and elegant. Drive a wedge between Wellington's British-led forces and Blücher's Prussians, defeat each in turn, and force the rest of Europe back to the negotiating table. Every hour's delay for the Allies was an advantage to him. On June 16th, the first great clash came at Quatre Bras. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of men and horses. Wellington arrived late in the day, his face streaked with dust, his calm unbroken. He rode the line with his hat tilted low, speaking little, observing everything. He saw where his troops wavered, where the Dutch Belgians faltered, where the Brunswickers held too long. His decisions were made in moments, instinct refined by years of war. The battle swayed violently, but by nightfall the French withdrew. It was no triumph, only survival, but it bought precious time. To the east at Ligny, Blücher's Prussians were not so fortunate. They fought with ferocious courage, but were crushed by Napoleon's main force. The old field marshal himself was unhorsed, nearly captured. Yet even in defeat, the Prussians did not break. They retreated north, still intact, still dangerous. That retreat, disciplined, deliberate, would soon change the fate of Europe. When word reached Wellington of Blücher's defeat, he was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once, his jaw tightening. "We shall fight here," he said, pointing to a ridge near the village of Waterloo. It was a line of high ground, narrow and defensible, not ideal, but sufficient. He would stand there, between the French and Brussels, and hold until the Prussians returned. His officers knew what that meant. They would face Napoleon's army alone, at least for a day. As the troops took their positions along the ridge, the rain began again, a slow, steady downpour that turned the fields into a sea of mud. Fires burned low. Muskets were cleaned in silence. Wellington rode the lines once more, speaking to the men in his usual measured tone. They could not know how heavily the night pressed upon him, how deeply he felt the weight of their trust. True command, he had learned long ago, was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. And in that mastery, others found their courage. In the darkness before dawn, the Duke looked east toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills, the Emperor was waiting. Two worlds were about to collide, one built on order, the other on ambition. The storm had gathered. Now it would break. The dawn came slow and grey over the sodden fields south of Brussels. Rain had fallen through the night, drumming against tents and helmets, soaking powder and boots. The ground was a quagmire, the clay clinging to every step, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Along the ridge of Mont-Saint-Jean, the British and Allied troops stirred to life, their scarlet coats darkened by the damp. The day that would decide the fate of Europe had begun. Wellington stood in the pale light, silent, his cloak drawn tight against the chill. Before him stretched his line, 24,000 British regulars, flanked by Dutch, Belgians, and Germans. Behind them waited reserves, artillery, and hope. Across the valley, Napoleon's army loomed like a living storm, 80,000 strong. Between them lay less than a mile of churned mud and trampled crops. The Emperor believed the battle was already his. Wellington knew better. He had chosen his ground carefully, the reverse slope of the ridge concealing his men from French guns. His defense would be deliberate, unyielding, the art of survival measured in minutes and blood. At around 11 o'clock, the first cannon fired. A deep thunder rolled through the valley, shaking the soaked earth. Napoleon's artillery opened the dance, 100 guns vomiting smoke and flame. The French Grand Battery tore at the ridge, but the mud swallowed the shot's fury, dulling their bite. Then, through the haze, the first columns advanced, the infantry of d'Erlon's corps, bayonets glinting beneath the clouds. They marched in perfect precision, the blue ranks undulating like waves across a grey sea. From his position near La Haye-Sainte, Wellington watched through his telescope. His face betrayed nothing, yet those beside him saw his knuckles whiten on the glass. "Steady, men," he murmured, more to the earth itself than to any single soldier. The British infantry waited until the French were within 50 paces. Then, on command, a sheet of flame burst from the ridge. Muskets cracked in disciplined volleys. The front ranks of the French wavered, then broke under the storm. The Duke's voice cut through the chaos, calm, measured, relentless. The rhythm of battle became his heartbeat. To the west, the chateau of Hougomont was already aflame. French skirmishers had surrounded the walled farm at dawn, turning it into a furnace of death. The guards within, Coldstreams, Scots, Grenadiers, fought room by room, their bayonets slick with rain and smoke. Doors splintered, walls collapsed, men fought with musket butts and fists. Through the inferno, a single gate stood half open. When the French rushed it, a handful of guards slammed it shut with their shoulders, trapping dozens inside. They were cut down in seconds. Wellington later said that the closing of the Hougomont gate was the moment that won the battle, not by tactics, but by sheer endurance. By mid-afternoon, the struggle had spread across the entire field. The French cavalry, glittering beneath torn banners, thundered uphill in wave after wave. Squadrons of cuirassiers crashed against the British squares, hollow boxes of men bristling with bayonets. Horses reared, bullets struck, sabers flashed, but the squares held firm. Each time the French withdrew, they left behind a carpet of bodies and broken lances. Wellington rode along the line, his uniform spattered with mud, shouting few words but radiating calm. "Stand fast," he told one regiment, "and you will see them off." He believed it, and because he believed it, so did they. At the center, the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte became a crucible of its own. A few hundred men of the King's German Legion held the position against thousands. Their ammunition ran dry. They fought from room to room, windows to doorways, until the walls themselves seemed to bleed. When at last the French took the farm, Wellington's center bent dangerously, the line faltering under the pressure. For an instant, defeat seemed to loom. Yet still, he did not break. "Night or the Prussians must come," he is said to have muttered, a truth as much as a prayer. Beyond the eastern woods, a low rumble began, not thunder this time, but cannon fire, distant yet growing. It was Blücher. The Prussian army, bloodied at Ligny, was coming after all. Their columns appeared like ghosts through the smoke, emerging onto Napoleon's right flank as dusk approached. The Emperor saw it and knew the balance was turning. Still, he refused to yield. As the light faded, he sent forward his last reserve, the Imperial Guard. The Old Guard advanced in silence, the most feared soldiers in Europe. La garde recule, and the Guard never retreated, had been their oath. They climbed the slope toward Wellington's center, their black bearskins cutting stark against the twilight. For a moment, even the British veterans felt the chill of awe. Then the order came, "Stand up!" The red ranks rose from the grass, unleashed a volley at near point-blank range, and the Guard staggered. A second volley followed, then a cheer, a roar that carried across the field. The invincible had been broken. Napoleon's army began to crumble. As the sun sank beyond the ridge, the Emperor's empire died with it. French soldiers fled through the mud. The Prussians pressed in from the east. Wellington sat his horse amid the wreckage, unmoving as darkness fell. Around him lay 20,000 dead and dying. The air was thick with the smell of powder and rain, the cries of men calling for water, for mercy, for home. The Duke said nothing. When at last someone asked how he felt, he replied only, "I am glad to have won, but I do not know why." That night, the rain returned. Fires burned low over the shattered fields. Napoleon had once said that in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 to 1. At Waterloo, it was endurance, not genius, not glory, that had decided the fate of Europe. When two wills of iron collide, history bends not to brilliance, but to the strength that refuses to break. The sun was sinking through a pall of gunsmoke when the final act began. The battlefield of Waterloo, once green and quiet, was now a ruin of trampled fields and burning farms. The air was thick with the stench of powder, blood, and mud. Horses without riders wandered aimlessly. Men lay where they had fallen, silent and still, or crying for help that would never come. And through it all, the guns continued, each blast a reminder that the fight was not yet done. Wellington's army stood battered, exhausted, yet unbroken. The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean was no longer a line of soldiers, but a living wall of endurance. For 10 relentless hours, they had faced charge after charge, infantry, cavalry, cannon, each wave breaking against them like surf on rock. The Duke himself rode among them, his uniform splattered with mud, his voice hoarse from command. There was no trace of triumph in him now, only the fierce determination of a man holding back history by sheer will. Across the valley, Napoleon prepared his last throw of the dice. The Imperial Guard, his most loyal veterans, the very soul of his empire, formed up at the base of the slope. They had never known defeat. To them, the word retreat was blasphemy. Around the Emperor, aides moved swiftly, carrying orders, reining in horses, relaying his commands with military precision. His face was pale, his expression iron. He believed even now that one more blow could shatter the Allied line and deliver him victory. But to the east, something stirred, faint at first, like distant thunder rolling over the hills. It was not the sky, but the ground that trembled. The Prussians were coming. For hours they had been marching from Wavre, through forests and flooded fields, the remnants of Blücher's army, bruised, bloodied, but relentless. The old marshal, nearly 70, had been thrown from his horse at Ligny and almost captured. Yet now he rode again, his face lined with mud and fury. "Forwards!" He had shouted to his men, "I promised Wellington we would come, and we shall keep that promise." As the first Prussian columns emerged from the woods of Frischemont, the French flank began to falter. The blue-coated soldiers of Bülow's corps advanced with grim resolve, their drums beating time through the thunder of cannon. They struck at Plancenoit, a small village anchoring Napoleon's right. What began as skirmish turned quickly to carnage. Musket fire echoing through narrow streets, church bells shattered by shot, the air thick with the screams of men, and the crash of collapsing walls. Napoleon, realizing the danger, sent his young guard to defend it. The village changed hands again and again, each exchange more desperate than the last. Wellington could not yet see the Prussians through the smoke, but he could hear the deep, rhythmic thunder of their guns to the east. "Give me night," he had said earlier, "or give me Blücher." Now it seemed he would have both. He watched his center bend under pressure, the ridge littered with the fallen, the survivors fighting in hollow squares, their faces blackened with powder and rain. They had nothing left to give, and yet they did not yield. Then came the moment of decision. Napoleon, sensing time slipping away, ordered his final reserve forward, the Old Guard. The order swept down the line like fire through dry grass. Drums beat. Eagles glinted through the haze. 12 battalions of the most feared soldiers in Europe began their steady climb up the ridge, bayonets gleaming, their ranks untouched by doubt. The French shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" As they advanced, their cry carried across the valley like a hymn to defiance. Wellington's officers watched in grim silence. They knew what was coming. The Duke, his face streaked with dirt, rode along the line and stopped near the center. He said almost nothing, a nod here, a few calm words there. "Stand fast," he told the guards. "Don't fire till you see them." The red ranks waited, kneeling in the grass, every man listening to the beat of the approaching drums. At 30 paces, Wellington gave the signal. The British line rose as one. A flash of steel and fire erupted across the ridge. The front ranks of the guard staggered under the shock. Another volley tore into them, then another. Smoke engulfed the hillside, and through it came a roar. "Charge!" The Allied troops surged forward, bayonets gleaming in the dimming light. The guard, once invincible, faltered, then turned. A ripple ran through the French army. "La garde recule!" The guard is retreating. What had never happened before was happening now. The illusion of Napoleon's invincibility shattered in an instant. To the east, Blücher's Prussians burst from the smoke, sweeping around Napoleon's flank and crashing into the remnants of his line. The two armies, British and Prussian, met not in words but in fire and thunder. What had begun as two separate struggles became one great convergence. A tide of men pushing back the empire that had once conquered all of Europe. Wellington's endurance and Blücher's vengeance met on the same field, sealing the fate of the age. As darkness fell, the French army broke. Drums fell silent, banners collapsed into the mud, and the emperor's silhouette vanished into the night. The thunder that had rolled from the east now surrounded the field completely. Not the sound of oncoming doom, but of deliverance. Wellington sat his horse beneath the ridge, too weary to speak, too stunned to feel triumph. The battlefield around him was lit by flickering fires and the glow of ruin. Blücher arrived soon after, mud-spattered and jubilant, the two commanders shaking hands in silence amid the wreckage of empires. They had done what neither could have achieved alone. No victory, perhaps, is ever won by one man alone. It is carried by the trust of those who march beside him, through doubt, through fear, through the long shadow of uncertainty. And on that field called Waterloo, the shadow at last became light. The battle was over, though the guns still echoed in the distance. Night had fallen over Waterloo, a night without stars, thick with smoke and the moan of the wounded. The field that had seen the rise and fall of empires now lay quiet except for the sound of dying men and the slow, steady drip of rain. The mud glistened darkly in the lantern light, and through it moved the silhouettes of soldiers, searching, weeping, or simply staring into the void. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had once redrawn the map of Europe with the sweep of a pen and the march of an army, was gone. His legions had vanished into the darkness, shattered and fleeing south towards the French border. The Imperial Guard, that living symbol of his invincibility, had been broken upon the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean. For years, the Emperor's name had meant destiny. Now it was only echo. Wellington rode slowly along the ridge, his horse picking its way among the fallen. His cloak was heavy with rain, his face drawn and pale. The lantern in his hand cast a small circle of light that flickered across bodies, French and British alike, indistinguishable in the mud. Here lay a drummer boy, no older than 15. There, a French officer still clutching his sword, his uniform torn by shot. The Duke's eyes moved from one to another, expressionless, yet those who saw him said there was something hollow in his silence. He had won, but there was no victory in it. Not in the way the world would soon imagine. The field at Waterloo was no triumphal stage. It was a graveyard. More than 40,000 men lay dead or dying. Horses screamed, wagons overturned, muskets sank into the muck. The sweet scent of lilac carried on the wind mixed with the bitter reek of gunpowder and blood. It was the price of an empire, laid bare beneath a sky that had no pity. At dawn, the rain eased. A thin mist clung to the ground as the first light revealed the scale of the ruin. British troops moved among the wreckage, collecting their wounded, covering the dead with tattered cloaks. The French prisoners sat in silent rows, their faces grey with disbelief. They had followed Napoleon across half the world, from the pyramids of Egypt to the snows of Russia, and now found themselves in a Belgian field, surrounded by the dead. Their emperor had promised glory. He had given them immortality of another kind. Wellington dictated his dispatch to London in a small farmhouse near Waterloo. His words were calm, factual, even restrained, as though describing a routine operation rather than the greatest battle of his life. "I cannot express the admiration I feel," he wrote, "for the conduct of the troops." There was no boast, no flourish, no rhetoric of conquest. His was the voice of duty, not of triumph. But when the pen stopped moving, he turned aside, bowed his head, and wept. His aides, shocked, pretended not to see. Across the frontier, Napoleon rode through the night toward Paris. His carriage jolted over ruined roads, past the wrecks of his army, past the men who still cried his name even as they fled. At every mile, the weight of defeat pressed heavier upon him. He had staked everything, his crown, his legend, his vision of France, on one final gamble and lost. When he arrived at the Élysée, he walked through the same doors that had once opened to acclamation. Now they creaked in silence. For the first time in 2 decades, Europe was free of his shadow. In Brussels, the city that had danced on the eve of battle, now filled its churches with candles. Women searched for names among the lists of the dead, their tears falling onto the marble floors. Officers limped through the streets, bandaged and hollow-eyed. The triumph had come at a cost that no one could yet comprehend. Newspapers would print it as victory. Painters would immortalize it in oil and canvas. But those who were there, the soldiers who fought, the generals who led, would remember only the silence that followed. When the news reached London, the bells of St. Paul's rang out in celebration. Crowds gathered in the streets, cheering the name of Wellington, waving flags beneath a sky that had finally cleared. But the Duke himself, back in his quarters, refused to celebrate. "Nothing," he said quietly, "except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." He knew that history would call it glory, that nations would build monuments, that poets would make myths. Yet he also knew what lay behind it. The faces, the cries, the unbearable weight of those who never returned. And so, as Europe rejoiced, Wellington sat alone, staring into the embers of his fire. The empire that had once threatened the world was gone. The man who had ruled it would soon surrender to his enemies and be sent across the seas to die in exile. But for the victor, there was no peace, only the long echo of memory. Victory has its silence, and that silence speaks louder than any cheer. It tells of all that was lost to secure it, and of the fragile peace that must now be guarded, lest the world forget how dearly it was bought. The guns of Waterloo had long fallen silent, but their echoes carried far beyond the fields of Belgium. In the uneasy calm that followed, Europe looked to a new kind of conqueror, not of lands, but of peace. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, stepped from the smoke of war into the fragile light of statesmanship. The soldier who had broken Napoleon's empire now faced a more subtle command: to preserve a continent scarred by victory. In the months after the battle, Wellington became the living embodiment of Britain's triumph. The Iron Duke, the man who had saved Europe. His carriage was mobbed in London streets, his likeness stamped on medals, his name toasted from Dublin to Delhi. Yet he wore fame as he wore his uniform, with restraint, almost discomfort. Those close to him remarked that he seemed older, graver, as though the weight of Waterloo had not lifted, but settled permanently upon his shoulders. He had seen too much of war to take pleasure in its rewards. At the Congress of Vienna, his task was not to conquer, but to reconcile. The victors of Europe gathered, kings and ministers, diplomats and princes, to redraw borders and reimpose order. The old empires returned to their thrones, but the world had changed. Revolutions had stirred ideas that could not be unlearned, and Wellington, though conservative by instinct, understood that the balance of power now rested not just on armies, but on restraint. He spoke rarely, but when he did, others listened. "We have won peace," he said. "Let us see that we do not lose it." Napoleon's end came quietly. Exiled to the distant island of St. Helena, he faded into the long twilight of memory, dictating his story, shaping his legend. In Europe's imagination, he became a myth, the fallen titan, the brilliant monster, the man who dared too much. But Wellington was flesh and discipline, not myth. He endured. Where Napoleon lived on in dreams, Wellington lived on in duty. His greatness was not in the blaze of his victories, but in the calm that followed them. Back in Britain, the Duke entered politics almost against his will. Made commander-in-chief, then prime minister, he approached the government as he had approached war, methodically, without ornament, with absolute honesty. He neither courted popularity nor feared unpopularity. "Nothing except my duty," he once said, "can ever be a motive to me." His premiership was marked by order, not passion. And by one of his finest acts of restraint, the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. It was a decision that cost him dearly among his peers. Yet he pushed it through, believing unity mattered more than applause. That courage, moral rather than martial, proved that victory in peace demands no less bravery than victory in battle. The years turned. Britain's empire grew, its armies marched across the globe, and its ships commanded the seas. Yet in drawing rooms and barracks alike, Wellington's example remained the measure of British virtue, discipline, honor, and humility before power. Soldiers quoted his words, politicians invoked his name, and the nation built statues not only to his triumphs, but to his restraint. He became a symbol not of conquest, but of constancy. The belief that greatness is not in domination, but in self-command. As the industrial age dawned, the world around him transformed. Steam engines roared through valleys, cities swelled, and a new Britain emerged, louder, richer, more restless. Wellington, now an old man, watched it with quiet curiosity. He no longer commanded armies, but he commanded respect. When he rode through London, crowds still cheered, hats raised, yet he bowed with the same modest grace. To those who asked how he wished to be remembered, he replied simply, as one who tried to do his duty. In September 1852, at the age of 83, the Iron Duke died at Walmer Castle, the sea murmuring against the cliffs below his window. The news struck the nation like a knell. Bells tolled in every city, flags fell to half-mast, and for days the streets of London were silent. His body was carried through the capital in a funeral procession, unlike any since Nelson's. Soldiers from every regiment he had ever led, veterans in worn medals, children perched on rooftops to glimpse the passing of an age. In St. Paul's Cathedral, beneath the vast dome that echoed with hymns of gratitude and grief, he was laid to rest beside other giants of Britain's history. His coffin bore no words of boast or conquest, only his name, his titles, and the dates of his birth and death. It was the simplicity he had lived by, and the restraint he had taught a generation to honor. Over time, the legend softened into legacy. The age of empire that followed would remember his victories, but forget too easily his caution. Wellington had fought not for glory, but for balance, a principle as fragile as the peace he had secured. And, as the 19th century marched on, Britain would learn again and again that power without humility leads only back to ruin. For the Duke of Wellington, greatness was never the roar of cannon, nor the applause of crowds. It was the quiet mastery of self, the refusal to yield to pride, the strength to do what was necessary and no more. He had defeated a conqueror, not by matching his ambition, but by outlasting it. And in the long silence that followed his passing, Britain seemed to understand the truest victory is not won on the battlefield, but in the wisdom to end the fight. Perhaps the measure of greatness is not the wars one wins, but the peace one leaves behind.